All right, so for this one, for the thermoregulation in humans, number 8 asks you, what is thermoregulation? What are you doing in thermoregulation, Caleb?
You're like what?
You what?
What? What did you say?
What is thermoregulation? What are you doing?
It's regulating the body temperature.
Yeah, you're regulating the body temperature. So number 9 asks you about what part of the brain does this, and so you can see that the hypothalamus does that. And so number 10 is asking you the 2 mechanisms that the body uses to cool itself. So the body uses it to cool itself when the temperature is too high. So we're looking at this part of the diagram, and this, we can see these are the 2 boxes that you should have there. So the blood vessels in the skin dilate. That increases blood flow to the skin, which carries a lot of heat, which then that will dissipate heat from the body into the atmosphere, as well as sweating. All right, so it triggers your sweat glands to make more sweat, and then we get our response. For the 2 mechanisms to heat itself, so that happens when the temperature is too low. The opposite happens. So the blood vessels contract, reducing and keeping the heat within the body, and then also the muscles begin to shiver, and that generates heat, and therefore heats up the body. So then for number 11, it asks you to look at just one side of this. It says, consider the feedback loop that cools the body when it's too warm. So we're just looking at the right-hand side of this. It asks you to identify the stimulus. The stimulus is the temperature being too high, okay, so the increase in body temperature. And then I had people ask this a lot yesterday throughout the day about the response. And so the response, the direct response is these 2 things. So as a result of the temperature being too high, this is the direct response. But ultimately, this is what happens. So I could see either one of those as being a response, because they both occur as a result of the temperature being too high. So if you had this, that's okay. If you put the body temperature decreases, that's okay as well. And then, is this feedback loop positive or negative feedback? This is another one I had a lot of questions on yesterday. Well, let's look at this. If we just look at this part here, are we amplifying or counteracting the stimulus? You're counteracting. The body temperature gets too high, and so we're going to bring it back down, so you're counteracting. So that represents negative feedback. Usually when you're talking about regulating something within the body, so keeping a body temperature, for example, within a narrow range, it's usually negative feedback. And usually there are 2 loops associated with that regulation, because there are, in this case, 2 different scenarios. If you want your body temperature to stay within here, this range, then you have to have a plan for too high and too low temperatures. And so therefore, each one of these is a negative feedback loop. And so there's 2 negative feedback loops to control body temperature. Does that make sense? And so therefore, to keep that, you're kind of alternating what your body's doing between the feedback loops to maintain that normal body temperature. Okay, so then number 12 asks you, looking at the left-hand side here, where the feedback loop that heats the body when it's too cold. And so the stimulus here is temperature being too low. And just like this one here, for the response, you could either have these 2 things, and I think that would be okay. That's the direct response, but ultimately that leads to this response. So if you had that, I think that would be okay as well. And this is also negative feedback, because you're counteracting the stimulus. The temperature is too low. So then 13 asks you, would a positive feedback loop ever be helpful in maintaining homeostasis? Positive feedback. Homeostasis, let's go back here. We maintain a certain condition within limits. And so this is an example of us maintaining temperature homeostasis. So would a positive feedback loop ever be helpful in maintaining homeostasis?
I said no, because it's almost exactly like temperature, because you're trying to maintain it in a certain area. So if you get too high above that, it's going to be a negative effect, because you're going to bring it back down. If you get too low, you're going to try and bring it back down.
That's exactly right. If it was positive feedback loop, when the temperature got too high, what would happen? In a positive feedback loop, the temperature would go even higher, right? And then that would negate. That would be a problem in our body. Why would that be a problem in our body?
Enzyme.
enzymes will become denatured, right? And so then it won't speed up our reactions, and death will soon follow. All right, so then B, would a single negative feedback loop ever be helpful in maintaining homeostasis? So I also had questions on this about what it was even asking here. So let me just clarify. What this means is that, like in body temperature regulation, if we only look at one feedback loop, so if we pretend like this right one isn't on here, and so if it was just this loop right here, a single feedback loop for the body temperature, would that work?
No.
Charlie?
No, because it would just, like, if the temp got too low and then that negative feedback loop kicked in, then it would, again, would be similar to if it was just one positive feedback loop. It would reach normal body temperature, but then that feedback loop would continue.
Yeah, it would get, and then we'd have no system in place for if it got too high. Absolutely. So that's why I said that when we're regulating, so keeping in narrow conditions, you usually have two loops that kind of work together to maintain that homeostasis. Okay, so let's look at the next picture with childbirth and contractions. So this is our picture here. So 14 asks you what is the stimulus and the response during childbirth. What's a stimulus, do you think? You want to raise your hand? The stimulus? You have an idea of what it would be here? Do you know?
Maybe like an action, a situation that starts to cause something, or like needs change.
Yeah, in this case here, as the baby gets bigger and drops lower in the uterus and it pushes against the cervix, that's the initial stimulus that's going to trigger this positive feedback loop. So the stimulus is actually the baby pushing against the cervix. And then that signals to the hypothalamus and it releases a hormone called oxytocin. And oxytocin goes through the bloodstream and reaches the uterus, and that communicates with the uterus and the cells of the uterus to contract. So then the uterine walls contract. When the uterine walls where the baby is contract, it pushes the baby down, it puts pressure, and therefore increases the pressure against the cervix, which then triggers more oxytocin to be released from the hypothalamus, which makes more uterine contractions, and so on and so forth. So that's what happens there. So the response of the push of the cervix ultimately is the uterine walls contracting. Okay, and the hormone that causes that to happen, that's a signal molecule that communicates, is oxytocin. So number 16, when the intensity of contractions increase, will the stimulus increase or decrease? You should have it increases. So when the contractions increase, the pressure increases, and therefore the stimulus is increased. So this is an example for 17 of positive feedback. So therefore, because the stimulus is being enhanced, all right, from the response. Okay. 18, what will eventually stop the stimulus and thus stop this childbirth positive feedback loop? What stops it? Does that go on forever, Emily?
When the child is born.
That's correct. When eventually that pressure, the baby will come out, and therefore there will be that pressure against the surface decreases. When that pressure, when the baby is born and out of the mother's body, that pressure decreases. That then stops the hypothalamus from secreting oxytocin, which means the uterine walls will stop contracting, and it all stops. All right, and so then number 19 gives you several descriptions about different things going on and asks you if they're positive or examples of positive or negative feedback. So letter A, when human tissue such as skin or a blood vessel is torn or cut, the cells near the damage send out a signal that activates little cells called platelets in the vicinity. As the platelets begin to form a plug, they release more chemical signals to attract more platelets and other clotting factors until the bleeding is stopped. So this one I had a lot of questions on all day because I had people that thought different things about this. And so oftentimes people would come up to my desk in pairs because one thought one thing, one thought the other thing. I wanted to know who was right. So I'll talk about the first one that people asked about. They focused on that you have a blood vessel torn or cut, so you're bleeding. And they said they said, well, at the end, yes, it activates and gets the platelets there, and then the bleeding is stopped. So therefore, for some people that counteracted that, though you have bleeding, and then you don't have bleeding, and so therefore, some people thought, well, that's a negative feedback. And focusing on that, I can see that it's a negative feedback. Can anybody see where there could be a link to positive feedback in here? Connor?
After the stimulus, it increases the platelets and clotting factors, so it kind of stops the bleeding, so it would be positive feedback.
Explain how that's positive. Like you said, what happened, but like why?
Because the the stimulus is stopped by the response. So after the platelets increase and the clotting factors increase, the bleeding on the body.
Yeah, but that's negative feedback.
Oh, yeah.
That's negative feedback. So when you stop the stimulus,
Yeah.
yes. So positive feedback.
The more platelets that are being produced, the more chemicals are released to small platelets, and it continues until the skin is healed and the skin will tear.
That's right. That's right. So if you focus on the platelets, so the chemical signal brought platelets there, which then produce more chemical signals to bring more platelets, which produce more chemical signals, and so on and so forth. So some people thought, well, if you focus on the platelets, that's a positive loop. All right. So I could see an argument for both of those. Okay. All right. So now letter B. I almost said number. Letter B. When a person has not taken in sufficient water, they become dehydrated. This may cause a loss of blood pressure, which will trigger the release of the antidiuretic hormone, or ADH, from the hypothalamus and pituitary glands. This hormone signals the kidney, so it's a hormone that moves from the hypothalamus up here through the bloodstream to the kidney, to allow reabsorption of water by the blood vessels to bring the blood pressure back to normal conditions. So, what is this, positive or negative feedback? Positive or negative feedback? Mike?
I think it's positive.
Why do you think it's positive?
I think it's positive because the signal wants something to continue to happen. So the signal, it signals the kidney to allow reabsorption of water, and it wants that to continue to happen. So it's rewarding something that happened. It wants it to continue.
All right, well, what caused it to want to reabsorb, the kidney to reabsorb water? Huh?
Negative.
So, somebody want to pick that up? There were just a minute ago several hands raised, and now nobody wants to say anything. Yeah.
Would it be negative because you're trying to get your body rehydrated from being dehydrated?
Yeah, so yes, and it is negative, but what do you think the stimulus was here?
Not enough water in the bloodstream.
Not enough water. And so really what is as a result of not having enough water in the blood vessels, there's not a lot of pressure. So actually, when it says the loss of blood pressure, that loss of blood pressure is the stimulus, because the stimulus, remember, usually triggers a signal molecule. So therefore, that triggers the release of the ADH. And then the ADH then causes a change to happen in the kidneys, and that change is the reabsorption of water. So your response ultimately is the reabsorption of water. Does that make sense? All right. So therefore, when the kidneys, what they do is they filter out your blood. And so what happens is if you are dehydrated, your kidneys will not put that much water into your urine. So when you're dehydrated, the volume of your urine goes down because your kidneys will reabsorb a lot of that water and put it back into the bloodstream. And so one of the reasons why that happens is when you're dehydrated and you haven't drank very much, so you don't have much water, your water level in your bloodstream goes down, the pressure in your bloodstream goes down, then your hypothalamus triggers ADH to signal to your kidneys, hey, we have low blood pressure, let's reabsorb water and not get rid of it in our urine. So they suck up all the water that would have gone into your urine, not all of it, but a lot of it, and goes back into your bloodstream, and then your blood pressure goes back up. So therefore, low blood pressure to high blood pressure, you're counteracting, and therefore it is negative feedback. And then lastly, you have letter C, when a human increases physical activity, the amount of fuel burned in its cell also increases. increasing cellular respiration, which in turn increases the concentration of CO2, a waste product of cellular respiration. The CO2 reacts with water in the blood to make a weak acid, which lowers the pH of the blood. Sensory cells in the medulla of the brain register this drop in pH. So that's your stimulus. It's the drop in pH. All right, it's not the high concentration of CO2. The high concentration of CO2 causes your blood to become acidic, and that's what triggers your brain to register that. Then your brain sends signals to the diaphragm, which is the muscle that controls your breathing, and heart to increase respiration and therefore increase your breathing rate, and you get out CO2. So your response is your increase in respiration, and therefore a rise in pH, because you're going to bring your pH back to normal, so that's negative feedback.
All right. Bus 31 will be here for 25. Once again, bus 31 for 25. And attention AM OTC students due to the assembly and revised schedule tomorrow. AM OTC students will need to
I
sign
have one more announcement after she gets done talking, so.
in order to be excused from your fourth hour. When you get here, it will be 6 hours, including the lunch that you take. So, again, all of you, sign at the podium upon returning to local tomorrow in order to be excused from fourth hour. So, if you're needing to know what lunch you're taking, please look at the attendance office window to find what